Hi everyone, Michael here, vegan space scientist. This video is going to be a call for effectiveness for animal protection advocates. I will argue that effectiveness is extremely important, and yet we don't think about it enough. This is important because it can be the difference between saving 100 animals, one animal, having no impact at all, or maybe even having a negative impact. I'll talk about some examples of where this can happen and how we can try and avoid it. This video will not be an argument for veganism or for considering non-human animals in our moral circle. I will assume that you're already convinced by these arguments, and if you're not, I'll have some links in the description below that will talk about that further. I want to start by talking a little bit about ethical frameworks. A lot of these videos I see people state some facts and then follow that up with some conclusions about how we ought to live our lives or what we should do, what actions we should take, what kind of actions are moral. I often see these videos completely ignore the fact that there are multiple codes of ethics that lead to very different conclusions. They will often assume that everybody follows their own particular code of ethics. When I talk about code of ethics, I'm talking about things like utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. For me, I'm a utilitarian, or more specifically, a total hedonic utilitarian. In simple terms, this means that I think suffering experienced by conscious minds is bad, and pleasure experienced by conscious minds is good. I think also that they're the only two things that can ethically matter. For example, I think rights are only useful insofar as they lead to less suffering or to more well-being. I don't think rights are intrinsically valuable. I mention this because a lot of what I will be talking about will be assuming a utilitarian code of ethics in terms of effectiveness. I don't think that utilitarianism is required to be thinking about effectiveness in terms of animal advocacy. I think you can apply effectiveness to any code of ethics and be able to get a better result. So why are we talking about effectiveness at all? Should it not be enough to say that a well-intended act, say for example, something that we do for the animals is good because it's for the animals? Why do we have to think about the effectiveness of the act? To answer that question, I'm first going to give a few examples from social interventions, where we have studied very well the long-term effects of certain interventions that we perform to help people. So the first example is Scared Straight. Now, Scared Straight is a program that has run in the US for about 4 decades. It involves taking teenagers who have performed some crime into prisons where they're yelled at, threatened, intimidated by guards and inmates. The idea is that the children will be scared straight or scared into not performing any more crime in the future. Now, I want to ask you as a viewer, if you haven't heard of this program before, or if you haven't seen the long-term effects, ask yourself, what do you think is the effect of this program on the children? Do you think, say, it has a positive effect on the children in the society that they're in terms of crime rates? Do you think it has a negative effect? Or do you think it has basically no measurable impact? So 9 randomized controlled trials were performed on the Scared Straight program over a 25-year period, and I'm just looking at my notes here. They looked at 8 different prisons, and these studies demonstrated that Scared Straight programs actually increase the odds that a participant will commit crimes in the future. The results are the same whether the program is aggressive or passive. The reason why people thought that these programs were working for so long is the children who went into the program did over time commit less crime. That is the case. However, when you compare the children who go into the program with other children who have performed crimes who don't go into the program, you see that the children who did not go into the program actually reduced their rate of crime faster than the children who did go into the program. So in other words, going into the program causes them to perform more crime than they otherwise would have. Despite this evidence, unfortunately, the Scared Straight program continues to operate, and people continue to believe that it's effective. A significant amount of money is still being spent on this program, and it's just making things worse, both for the children and for society as a whole. A second program, which I'll have to read from my notes here, is second responder programs, which try to stop the repetition of family violence. A police officer and victim advocate come to your home a few hours or a few days after an incident has occurred. They talk to the victim about services and legal options, and they may warn the offender of legal consequences if abuse continues. Second responder programs are used in many major US cities, with 5 states and over 4,000 households covered in one review alone. So, question for you is, do you think these second responder programs reduce family violence, increase family violence, or have no measurable effect? So 10 high-quality studies were performed covering over 4,000 households. A review of all of these 10 studies saw that the second responder intervention did not reduce the likelihood of repeat violence. However, it was found to slightly increase the odds that victims would report incidents to the police. So the primary intended effect of the program, which was to reduce family violence, was not achieved. It did not seem to have a negative impact on that, but only to seem to have roughly no impact on that. However, there was a slight unintended benefit of people being more likely to report crimes. So that's still positive, but otherwise it largely had no effect. The review concludes that policymakers will have to decide whether the small gains in the willingness to call the police is worth the cost of these programs. And I think that last point really hits home on what I'm trying to get at here. First of all, the point of giving you these examples was to show you just how hard it is on hearing a description of a program to tell how effective it is, or to tell whether it has a negative, positive impact or no impact. It's really hard. Our intuitions are not good judges of effectiveness. The second point, which this quote touched on, is opportunity cost. So even if a program is having a positive effect, if the same money can be spent on another program that has, say, double or 10 times or 100 times the impact, then maybe that money should be spent on that other program instead. This is important because, unfortunately, we have limited time, resources, money that we're able to distribute, whether it's as an individual, as a philanthropist, or say as a government organization that is looking to distribute their funding to have as much impact as possible. So again, I want to reiterate the point that I touched on before I gave these examples, which is that we shouldn't assume actions have a positive outcome just because they have positive intentions. So to bring this back to animal advocacy, just because an action has positive intentions, just because it's for the animals, does not mean that it has a positive outcome. Looking at the effectiveness and the evidence for any intervention that we do, whether it's to help humans or non-humans, it could be the difference between life and death. I want to talk about another concept called quality-adjusted life years, or sometimes they're known as disability-adjusted life years, which is a little bit different but a similar metric. So QALYs or DALYs are a comparison tool we can use to compare very different programs and their impacts when we're trying to prioritize what we want to spend our resources on. So for example, QALYs are trying to capture how much do we improve the quality of someone's life, but also how much do we extend their life. Now, one quality-adjusted life year would be seen as 1 year of near-perfect quality of life. So we were looking to compare one program, say, which extended someone's life by 5 years through some medical intervention, but their quality of life was only about 0.5, or half of what it would be with perfect quality of life. If we wanted to compare that to another program, which maybe doesn't extend someone's life, but it increases their quality of life from, say, 0.5 to 1. QALYs gives us a way to compare these two programs. It gives us a way to compare very different programs as well. And I think we can apply this to non-human animal advocacy. When we think about different programs that might affect the lives of animals, whether it extends their life, whether it reduces suffering, this gives us a way to compare it. For one last example from human-focused interventions, look at the chart that I have here on the screen. So this is a distribution of the cost effectiveness in terms of disability adjusted life years per dollar spent for different programs. These programs are all related to HIV. We can see that at the top we have surgical treatment for Kaposi sarcoma, which is an expression of HIV. It's not particularly effective compared to the other interventions in terms of how many disability adjusted life years can we save per dollar spent. We look at the second, which is antiretroviral therapy, which is a bit better, and so on, until we see that the cost effectiveness for education for high-risk groups about HIV, about sexual health, the effectiveness for this is so much higher than some of the other interventions that it's actually orders of magnitude more effective to spend money on that program than, say, on surgical treatment for Kaposi sarcoma. Now, I've been using examples from human-centric interventions because, unfortunately, there is still very limited evidence and research performed on the effectiveness of interventions to help non-humans. When I say interventions, I'll talk about these a little bit more later, but just to give out some examples for now, this could mean something like, say, leafleting to encourage people to go vegan. It could be undercover investigations and spending resources on that. It could be billboards. Anything that has the intended outcome of helping non-humans. A lot of what I'm talking about today draws heavily on the effective altruism movement and the ideas presented by it. One of the ideas is this idea of cause prioritization. So when we're comparing very different causes, how do we know which ones we should be focusing on? There are 3 pillars that can be used in cause prioritization, and they are scale, tractability, and neglectedness. Scale is a measure of just how big is the problem and how good would it be if that problem went away. If a problem is very big, then that should mean that it's more important that we focus on it. But if a problem is very small, maybe it's not so important that we prioritize that over other problems. Tractability or solvability is a measure of how easy is it to do something about. Some problems are huge in scale, but they're actually just not that tractable. it's very hard to make progress in that area. And so again, this should play a role in our prioritization. And the last is neglectedness. So how neglected is the issue? How many people are already working on this problem? How many resources are going into this? You can imagine that if an issue has already thousands of people working on it with billions of dollars of funding globally, it's very hard for someone new to come in and to have a significant marginal impact in that area. However, if you come into a new problem that maybe doesn't have anyone working on it, then you can have a lot of marginal impact by being one of the first people to work on that problem and to raise awareness about it. To prioritize causes or to prioritize interventions, we need to be looking at all three of these pillars. I want to give an example just quickly of neglectedness in the animal advocacy context. This diagram is taken from animal charity evaluators. It looks at the number of animals used and killed on the left here in the United States every year, and the amount of money donated to animal charities on the right. So we're looking at a couple of different categories, including farmed animals, shelters, animals used in labs, and animals used for clothing. So on the left, we can see that overwhelmingly, most animals are used and killed in factory farms, in farming in the US. Significantly smaller than that is lab animals, but that still dwarfs the number of animals that end up in shelters. And then when we look on the right, we see that most of the money being donated to animal organizations is going to shelters, with very little going to help animals in farms, which under that would be included, say, vegan outreach or convincing people to be vegan or something like that. Now, I would like to make the case that this data suggests that factory farming, farming in general, is, within the animal context, massive in scale, probably one of the biggest in scale. However, it's also very neglected. And I'd like to make the case that as great animal shelters are, the amount of funding going towards them is significantly more than the scale of the problem suggests. So I would like to argue that from this data, we should be spending significantly more resources to help animals in farms. When we're looking at helping animals, we often focus on the number of people that we convince to be vegan, or the number of people that we've convinced to consume fewer animal products. I think it's important that we actually look at how much impact this is actually having on the lives of animals, because we don't care about the number of vegans for its own sake. We care about the number of vegans that we create because of how much it reduces animal suffering. Or at least I do as a utilitarian, and a deontologist or virtue ethicist might have a slightly different take. But at the same time, I think that creating extra vegans is a proxy for what they really care about. I want to read some statistics here that talk about the number of animals used and consumed by non-vegans in a standard Western diet, which we can use to try and just estimate how much impact a individual is having when they go vegan in terms of the number of fewer animals that are being bred into farms. Rather than referencing the sources of all of this information as I go, I'll have a link to the review paper that I co-authored, which has these sources within. So the average meat-eating American is expected to consume about 30 land animals a year, including 28 chickens. The number of marine animals consumed is significantly harder to estimate, and there is a large amount of biofuel associated with the fishing industry. But some estimates suggest between 1 trillion and 2.7 trillion wild marine animals are killed globally each year. Animal charity evaluators estimates that the number of farmed fish eaten per capita each year in the US is 2 to 3, including wild fish, as well as those caught to feed the farmed fish. Animal charity evaluators estimates that annual per capita consumption of marine animals is 46 to 79, with an additional 186 shellfish per year, most of which are shrimp. Around 2 egg-laying hens are required to feed the average egg-eating American per year, and 1 cow is required to meet the dairy consumption of 30 Americans. Every year, 1 lab animal is experimented on in the US for every 15 Americans. Around 1 animal is killed for their fur each year per 100 Americans. Animals are also killed in the process of crop production. One study by Gavrik Matheny in 2003 suggests that at least 0.3 animals, not including invertebrates such as insects, are killed each year in the process of producing crops for the average American vegan. This number, I think, would be even higher for the average American non-vegan, since a lot of crops are grown to feed animals in the livestock industry. I mention this because I think it's important that we really try and consider the impact that we as vegans are having, as well as non-vegans. I mentioned animal charity evaluators earlier. As well as putting out research on the effectiveness of various interventions, they also look at the effectiveness of charities, and they try and make recommendations to people on what charities are effective and how people should be using their donations. I'm not going to talk about any specific charities that ACE has recommended here in this video because the recommendations are updated every year. Instead, I'm just going to have a link to their recommendations in the description below. This brings me on to my next point, which is about donations and earning to give. Earning to give is a concept coined by the effective altruism movement, and it involves, rather than doing some direct work, say working for a non-profit organization or doing some kind of project, instead you focus on earning money as effective as you can, earning as much money as you can, and donating that money to effective organizations that help humans and non-humans. This certainly isn't to say that effective altruism suggests that earning to give is what you should be doing and that you should drop everything else to do that. I think it depends on personal fit, but I can say for sure that I think earning to give is still neglected and not considered enough by the broader non-human advocacy movement. I think we could benefit from more people taking high-paying jobs and donating their disposable income to organizations that help non-human animals really effectively. As a utilitarian, I think that an inaction can be as morally culpable as an action. For example, I think that if you walk past someone drowning that you could save and you do not save them, then you are just as morally blameworthy as if you had pushed that person into the pond and drowned them yourself. All else being equal, of course, I'm assuming you can swim and so on. The reason I say this is because I think suffering is bad regardless of how it is caused. I think pleasure is good regardless of how it's caused. It doesn't matter whether it is caused by natural causes or unnatural causes or whether you had an involvement in that. I think we have a duty to try and reduce suffering as much as we can. And so having said that, I believe that we should all be spending more of our disposable income donating and supporting effective organizations. I personally have taken a pledge to donate everything I earn over $45,000 a year. I'm not suggesting that everyone does this. However, I think it's a very manageable number for me. I think that $45,000 is more than enough for me to live a very comfortable lifestyle and still spend money on my own enjoyment, leaving money to support effective causes and to try and reduce suffering as much as possible. As I said, there has been some limited research trying to compare the effectiveness of interventions to helping non-human animals. I personally think it is still premature to be saying which interventions are the most effective interventions to help non-humans. I actually think that at the moment, the most effective thing we can be doing as animal advocates is, rather than to be helping animals directly, is to be thinking about how we can best help animals most effectively. I think this kind of meta level of research is the most important thing at the moment. I think it's where we should be directing more funding, certainly much more than we're directing at the moment, relative to helping out non-human animals directly. And for what it's worth, I think this is the case as well for helping humans or for trying to improve the long-term trajectory of humanity. So in this video, I'm not going to be talking anymore about the effectiveness of any individual interventions. Instead, I'm going to leave another link below which summarizes some of that work. I want to briefly talk about wild animal suffering. Wild animal suffering more or less means what it sounds like. We're thinking about the suffering experienced by animals in the wild, so not animals in factory farms. And mostly we're talking about animals suffering due to natural causes, whether it's animals suffering from other animals, or parasites, eating an animal alive, or an animal starving to death, freezing to death, being overheated, falling down a ravine and injuring their leg and dying very slowly. I'm trying to be a little bit graphic here because I really want to paint a picture that nature is not as idyllic as people think it is. Nature is actually quite terrifying. To be a wild animal is a horrible fate, in my opinion. And I mentioned before that I don't think any individual really cares about what their suffering or what their pleasure is caused by, when it really comes down to it. This has to be especially true for non-human animals. If a non-human animal feels pain, it does not matter to them in the slightest whether that pain is caused by a human, another animal, or some other cause. I'd argue that that pain is bad and that we should want there to be less pain. There's also an idea proposed in the wild animal suffering field that some animals might actually have net negative lives. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about wild animal suffering here because I don't think I'm going to be able to do it justice in a few minutes anyway. I think I'm going to just leave a link to an introductory text on wild animal suffering by Brian Tomasic in the description below. If any of this sounds weird, then I just suggest reading that before you make any judgments based on what I've talked about so far here. But just to round that topic out, I'm going to just say this. We consider the suffering of humans caused by other humans to be bad, and we want to try and reduce that. Typically, we also think that the suffering of humans caused by some natural cause is bad, and we want to try and reduce that as well. Whether it's a human, say, suffering from some disease, or suffering from heat stroke, anything that you would consider natural if it occurred to an animal, we want to stop this if it happens to a human. We want to prevent it. And yet, when it comes to non-humans, many people seem to only be concerned about the suffering that humans cause to non-humans, not concerned about the suffering of animals due to natural causes. I would actually suggest that this is speciesist. Why should we care about natural suffering experienced by humans, but not by non-humans? I'm not proposing here any solution. I think that it's premature to propose solutions for the suffering experienced naturally by wild animals. Some people like to strawman this argument by saying, what do you think, we should kill all predator animals or something like this? I don't think many people in the wild animal suffering space are even suggesting that. I think the main thing that we are putting forward is that the suffering is bad and we should think about how we can try and prevent it, if we can do so without any long-term negative effects. And that really is the main point here, because a common objection is, what about the long-term negative effects of intervening in the wild? And what if you make things worse? Well, I think I'd bite the bullet on that and say, yes, there is a chance we could make things worse. There's a chance we could make things better. The reality is that most intervention we've done in the wild to date as humans has not been for the benefit of the animals. It has not been with the animals in mind. It has almost always been with the intention of making things better for humans. So when people raise past human intervention in the wild as an example of why we shouldn't intervene in the future, I don't think this is quite right. I think if we really carefully considered our options, we looked at the long-term effects of intervening in the wild to help non-human animals, I think we may well come to the conclusion that there are things we can do to help them and improve their lives. I think that their suffering is bad and we should absolutely do something about that. So finally, I want to conclude with a point about open-mindedness. Since becoming vegan 5.5 years ago, I've constantly been changing my mind on the effectiveness of different things that I can do to help animals. I think it's important that we all stay open-minded because we learn new information, we discover new evidence, and this should cause us to update our beliefs. So whether you care about reducing suffering, whether you care about stopping people from killing animals, whether you care about exploitation, I think you can still care about effectiveness and trying to improve the world as effectively as possible through your ethical framework. So I think I'll leave the video there. Please, if you enjoyed it, please do subscribe, leave a like and a comment to let me know what you think. And happy to answer any questions about this because I know I've tried to cover a lot of stuff very quickly. And if you didn't like the video, tell me why and leave a dislike because I value your feedback. It's all I have. So thank you again for listening and I hope you have a good day.